April 9th, 1865, Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. The road buckled under tired hooves as the last gray wagons creaked east. Inside the canvas were sacks of flour that never reached hungry regiments, crates of bacon that never saw a campfire, and corn meant for horses that had been eating fence rails for weeks. Behind them, blue cavalry swung in from the north and west. Ahead of them, a rumor galloped faster than any courier. The ration trains at Appomattox Station were gone, taken in the night. For Robert E. Lee, the decision would be written in the arithmetic of empty wagons. The Army of Northern Virginia did not run out of courage, it ran out of calories. The Confederacy could fight. It could march, charge, and bleed. It could dig trenches and storm parapets and hold a line with bare feet in the snow. But it could not feed fast enough, move far enough, or replace quickly enough. This is the story of a war many remember as a duel of generals and bayonets, yet one decided by mules, rails, riverboats, salt, paper money, and the quiet tyranny of distance. This is the story of how logistics, neglected in peace and improvised in war, starved victory itself. In 1861, logistics was an ecosystem. It was more than wagons and warehouses. It was food procurement from farms and mills. It was commissary depots that took crops and turned them into rations. It was private railroads stitched together by schedules and hope. It was river and coastal shipping in wooden hulls and iron hulls, tugboats and side-wheelers, and the wharves that loaded them. It was horses and mules and the forage they required to survive the march. It was ordnance trains of powder and shot. It was clothing and shoes and blankets. It was medical transport and hospital trains, and it was the telegraph, the nervous system that told all of them where to be. The United States entered the war with a quartermaster habit, a set of contracts, a fleet, a river culture, coastal tonnage, and the largest railroad mileage on the continent. The Confederacy began with warehouses of cotton, brave officers, and the hope that iron, engines, and salt would materialize in time. Cotton could buy cannons, if cotton could move. Men could fight, if their feet did not split through shoes made of nothing but hope. The math of the era was unforgiving. One adult soldier needed roughly 3 pounds of food per day, about 3,000 calories, plus fuel to cook it. A horse needed 10 to 12 pounds of grain and 15 pounds of hay. A 1,000-man regiment on the march required around 1.5 tons of rations daily before feeding a single horse. Multiply by cavalry, artillery teams, and wagon animals, and then ask your railroads with mismatched gauges and aging engines to deliver it on time while armies move and bridges burn. Ask your quartermasters to find barrels, sacks, carts, drivers, harness, shoes, and candles when prices sprint faster than pay, and paper money dissolves value like rain on chalk. At first, the South laughed. Newspapers joked about Yankee bookkeepers and paper-pushing commissaries. Why fuss with ledgers when pigs roamed the pine woods and corn stood high in every county? Why bother with depots when every smokehouse in Dixie was a depot? The joke ended when peace did. Armies concentrate mouths. Concentrated mouths devastate a countryside in weeks. Units marching through friendly counties find barns locked against them and smokehouses already raided by the last brigade. Locals hide food. Prices jump. Forage parties scatter, and with them scatter discipline, time, and blood. The first pivot from laughter to shock arrived when commanders realized that living off the land translates to standing still. Foraging can feed a division that rests. It starves a campaign that moves. If you want operational reach, if you want to throw punches beyond the next county, you must stockpile, schedule, and ship. Consider the railroads. On paper, the Confederacy possessed roughly 9,500 miles of track in 1861. The Union had about 21,000. The numbers misled. Southern lines were short, radial, born to move cotton to ports, not armies between theaters. Worse, gauges differed. 5 foot here, 4 feet 8½ inches there, 5 foot 6 somewhere else. Every break of gauge was a choke point where freight had to be unloaded by hand and reloaded onto a different car. A day lost at a junction erased a day of marching. Engines and cars wore out faster than in peace. Bearings ran hot, rails shattered, bridges burned. Replacements depended on iron mills the South barely had, and on machine tools it largely did not. You can cannibalize one line to patch another for a while. When you are always cannibalizing, your network eats itself to survive. Meanwhile, the North learned to treat a railroad as a weapon. Rails were standardized. Timetables were synchronized. Repair crews became soldiers with wrenches. When track broke, it was rebuilt and guarded. When a bridge fell, it was measured, prefabricated, and raised again. When a locomotive failed, a replacement rolled out of a shop that had a shelf of parts and a manager who could order more without begging a governor. The Union did not simply have more iron, it had a culture of interchangeability. Now consider the mathematics of motion. A single daily train of 20 cars with 10 tons each can move 200 tons from depot to army. That seems like a lot until you divide the load by mouths, hooves, and guns. 200 tons is theoretically enough to feed about 60,000 men for a day if every pound is food and none is forage, ammunition, or medical. Real life demands all three. Missing one day is tolerable. Missing 3 produces an epidemic of hunger. The Confederate network missed days as a matter of design, as a consequence of gauge and scarcity, as a result of politics that kept private lines private even when a nation needed them public. Preservation was a battle of its own. Fresh meat spoils, stands of corn mold, flour goes rancid when wet. In the 1860s, salt was a strategic resource. Salt preserved pork and beef. Salt kept a march moving long after harvest. The best caverns were in Union hands or under threat. The Confederacy's main sources were precious, overworked, and targeted. Interdiction, raids, or a rail disruption rippled instantly. No salt meant no pork. No pork meant no protein. No protein meant no marching. Society preserves calories so that an army can consume them. Every barrel of pork not packed in October was a brigade that could not leave winter quarters in March. Salt was morale as well. Salt pork, salt beef, salt fish, these were the tastes that promised strength. Take away meat and soldiers traded rations, deserted to farms, or grew sick on cornmeal alone. By late war, many Confederate rations had shrunk to a powder of parched corn and the occasional issue of rancid bacon. Courage cannot metabolize rancid bacon. Artillery did not move itself. Wagons did not roll by wish. Equine logistics governed everything that moved after the railhead. A campaign burned through horses like a furnace. Between disease, overwork, and starvation, the Confederacy bled its horsepower at a rate it could not replace. A dead horse did not just silence a gun, It stranded a wagon, which stranded a regiment, which stranded a plan. The North had remount depots and a market to buy more. The South had gentlemen's mounts, country stock, and the hope that foraging would keep them alive. Forage is heavy, hay is bulky. Rail cars that carry hay do not carry flour. Choose wrong, and your guns arrive on time with no shells, or your flour arrives and your teams are skeletons. Think about the mathematics of traction. An average 6-mule team can pull roughly 2 to 3 tons on decent roads under ideal weather. Add mud, hills, or broken harness, and you have that. Every mile from the depot cuts your combat power by a slice of mule ribs. The commissary ran into a cage of politics. To fight a modern war, you centralize supply. To satisfy doctrine and states' rights, you decentralize. Governors guarded their depots. Local boards resisted impressment. Rail lines refused to run military loads without cash up front. Contractors bid high and delivered low. A currency printing press, more promises than gold, made prices climb faster than pay. Officers watched tons of grain sit because a quartermaster lacked the authority to seize it or the money to pay for it. Meanwhile, soldiers made shoes out of rawhide and called it hospital leather because it sent feet to the hospital. The joke about Yankee paperwork returned with a twist. Early mockery became late war snarls about our paperwork because orders without execution power are paper bullets. The Union's bureaucracy looked slow until you needed 200 wagons on Wednesday and received 200 wagons on Wednesday. Confederate paperwork could be lightning fast. The wagons simply did not exist. The blockade tightened the vice. The Confederacy gambled that cotton would force European intervention. Instead, the world discovered that stocks and alternate suppliers could blunt cotton diplomacy. Blockade runners became heroes with sleek hulls and daring captains, but they optimized for profit, not war priorities. A hold of luxury goods paid better and risked less than a hold of salt or rifle muskets. Even when arms arrived, they trickled. Even when machinery arrived, it wanted coal, spare parts, and skilled labor to run it. Cotton filled warehouses inland, immobile value that could not be eaten or forged into rails. Every bale that could not move was a hungry regiment with its food trapped inside white fiber. The strategic economics flipped. The South had export wealth, but no liquidity at the front, and a currency dissolving in acid inflation. Consider Vicksburg. The Confederate High Command saw Vicksburg as a fortress. The Union saw it as a traffic light over a continent-spanning highway. When the river fell to Union gunboats and transports, the Confederacy was not just cut in half on a map. It was cut in half in the bloodstream. Texas beef and sugar could not cross. Trans-Mississippi troops became a different war. Siege lines are about trenches and guns, but the deciding factor was throughput. Grant could feed his men across a river with steam and schedules. Pemberton could not refill a city encircled on water and land. Courage inside Vicksburg was iron. The ration line was chalk. A single high-water steamer could carry 400 to 600 tons. A week of uninterrupted runs could move more than an entire railway district with fewer breakdowns and no gauge problems. River control is logistics dominion. Now Chattanooga. Confederate staff bet that the Union Army in Chattanooga would starve, penned by mountains and river bends. Then, in a pre-dawn choreography of boats and bayonets, the Federals opened the Cracker Line. Brown's Ferry was seized, a pontoon bridge was thrown, and Lookout Valley was secured. Within hours, wagons rolled. Within days, depots bulged. The siege's spine broke without a grand assault. The punchline was logistical. Paper-pushing Yankees turned topography into a conveyor belt. For the Confederates, the countermath was brutal. Their own lines wound over inadequate rails and bad roads, guarded by cavalry low on forage. The wagons were always late, the animals always thin. When the Union turned supply into tempo, Missionary Ridge was foretold. Clothing, shoes, and disease were quiet killers. Marching power is not merely food, it is feet. The Confederate soldier, especially in the West, often marched in worn brogans or barefoot. Wet feet in winter with thin socks meant trench foot before trenches were famous. Wool uniforms became a patchwork of captured blue and homespun gray. Blankets were precious. Tents were a luxury. Scurvy, dysentery, and typhoid were not accidents. They were supply chain outcomes. Lime juice, fresh vegetables, and clean water in sufficient barrels are logistics inputs. An army that cannot keep its men warm and fed cannot keep them in the ranks. Desertion is sometimes a statistic. Often it is a supply decision made by a starving man who sees his family's smokehouse in his dreams. Inflation ate wagons. As Confederate currency multiplied, its value inverted. Wages lagged, prices sprinted. A bushel of corn became a month's pay. A pair of shoes cost a bounty. Private contractors demanded hard currency or goods. The government printed more notes to buy the same wagon. The wagon maker could not buy iron because the railroad charged more. The railroad charged more because coal cost more. Coal cost more because miners wanted food. Food cost more because armies ate counties. Inflation is not an abstract chart. It is a drumbeat that drowns orders. It tells every man in the chain to wait a week more until the waiting becomes defeat. Sherman taught a brutal lesson. Destroy the system, not the soldier. In Georgia, in 1864, he mapped rail depots, mills, bridges, roundhouses, cotton gins, and warehouses. He burned what moved goods, not simply what hurt feelings. Ties were heated and twisted into neckties that no train could ride. The goal was to punch holes in an already fragile network until replacement became impossible. The North could rebuild in months. The South sometimes could not rebuild at all. Look at who Sherman fought most: rails, mills, depots, trestles, telegraph lines, locomotives, horses, cornfields, and cotton bales. Every mile of track ruined was a month of hunger for a Confederate brigade 200 miles away. Every mill destroyed was a winter coat never cut. Every captured rail junction was a timetable torn in half. In the Western theater, distance wore a general's stars. From the Ozarks to the Gulf, Confederate supply lines stretched over pine barrens, bayous, and thin rails. River control flipped constantly. Roads dissolved after rain. Bridges took time and timber they could ill spare. Commanders ordered advances sized by imagination. Wagons delivered realities sized by axle grease. Campaign plans that looked bold in a tent met a country of mud and a shortage of shoes and turned cautious by necessity. Timetables slid. Opportunities closed. When opportunities close often enough, an army convinces itself that caution is wisdom, but the real author is hunger. Now turn to the factories that never were. A rifle needs a barrel, a lock, a stock, and a man who knows how to fit them. Powder needs saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal in the right proportions. Shell fuses need brass and a lathe. A railroad car needs seasoned timber and iron plate. The Confederacy could build all of these in places and at times, and it did, but it could not build them in the volume and with the predictability required to outlast an opponent who already had the production lines spinning. One shop could produce miracles for a month. War demands routine for years. The South raised talented ordnance officers and clever contractors. It did not have enough machine tools and skilled hands to turn cleverness into abundance. Scarcity multiplied the cost of mistakes. A single wrecked locomotive on a key line did not inconvenience a schedule. It erased a week of deliveries to the front. Then there was the human toll of substitution. When leather ran short, soldiers received shoes that chewed their feet. When tin ran short, rations arrived in paper that water destroyed. When wool ran short, uniforms came in mixed cloth that unraveled in rain. Men learned to hate objects that fail them. A faulty harness is not an inventory error to a driver. It is the memory of a wagon stuck in a creek, with shells sliding into water while cavalry gathers on a ridge. A ration short by half is not a percentage. It is the sound of a stomach that cannot sleep. The longer the war went on, the more objects failed, and every failure compounded the next. Leadership tried to adapt. Commanders reorganized wagon trains. Quartermasters fought for priority on rails. Schedules were written and enforced with what authority they possessed. Impressment laws were passed. Depots were consolidated. Officers learned to read the terrain not just for battle but for supply. But adaptation without resources is a plan drawn with a dry pen. You can command a train to arrive. You cannot command a bridge to repair itself without timber, or a switch to work without a smith. The Confederacy's greatest enemies were not names in blue. They were delays that bred more delays. Listen to the stories along the roads. A teamster sleeps on empty sacks and wakes to the sound of harness creaking because the leather shrank in the night and snapped at the first tug. A commissary clerk stares at barrels that smell wrong and knows that an entire week of meat has turned to poison. A depot officer signs receipts for corn that is half husk and weevil, and he signs anyway, because an army cannot eat nothing. A surgeon begs for ice and gets a cart of sawdust because everyone upstream thought someone else would find ice. No grand strategy explains these moments, yet they accumulate until they outweigh strategy itself. Turn back to the rivers, those highways of the interior. Where the North gained control, it could weld together theaters with steam. A tow of barges carried what an army swallowed in days. A fleet of transports leapfrogged troops and their supplies from bend to bend and town to town, avoiding the terror of bad roads. Where the South held a stretch, it could do the same, but its fleets were fewer, its pilots scarcer, its coal uncertain, its wharves quickly targets. A riverboat is a miracle when it is fueled and guarded. It is a bonfire when it is cornered and dry. Control of the waterways did not simply eliminate a Confederate option. It removed the fastest repair mechanism for land-based shortage. When a rail failed, a river could have compensated. When the river was lost, there was nothing fast left to compensate with. Now think about information. A telegraph wire carries orders. It also carries reality. If the wire runs, a general learns the truth of his depots in hours. If the wire is cut, he learns by rumor, and the rumor is always kinder than the ledger. The Confederacy's telegraph system struggled to keep pace with the mobility of the war. Wires sagged, batteries ran down, operators were drafted, poles were eaten by fire or by need. The Union laid wire as a routine practice, with trained crews and spare reels. Once again, the difference was not simply that one side had more, it was that one side normalized the act of repair. Normalizing repair is the quiet superpower of logistics. The home front was a battlefield too. Every wagon that rolled to an army was a wagon that did not roll to a county seat with flour, or to a farm with seed, or to a mill with grain. Households adapted, then strained, then snapped. When a farm snaps, the army feels it months later. A pig that is not born in spring is not bacon in winter. A field that is not plowed in April is not cornmeal in October. The Confederate soldier who slips away to help a family harvest is not a coward. He is an unwilling participant in arithmetic, dragged from his company by math. When enough men do this, a regiment becomes a rumor on a muster roll. Currency turned from tool to toxin. A note in the pocket meant food at the start. By the middle, it meant a promise. At the end, it meant a souvenir. Soldiers and civilians turned to barter because barter carried truth. A wagon for iron, a bushel for a pair of shoes, a side of bacon for a sack of salt. Barter is a confession that money is broken. Broken money lengthens every errand because every deal must be negotiated anew. Negotiation takes time. Time is the one ration no army can store. The armies in the West tell the story in long lines on maps that dribble away into nothing. Campaign plans called for swift thrusts and decided battles. The hoofbeats slowed at the first swollen creek and stopped at the second broken bridge. Picture the march as a rope. Each wagon is a knot in the rope. When a knot tightens, it steals slack from the rest of the length. When 3 knots tighten, the rope stops moving. Leaders pulled and shouted, and the rope did not listen. The rope only obeyed friction. Friction won more Western fights than any general did. Petersburg, with its miles of works and its months of mud, has a different reputation, yet the same cause. The Union built a city whose only purpose was to feed a siege. Wharves sprouted, rail spurs snaked out, bakeries rose with smokestacks that breathed bread, slaughterhouses hummed, ice houses filled, hospitals expanded. The machine did not blink when a corps shifted or a division lengthened the line. The machine simply rolled more trains and opened more crates. Across the lines, the Confederate system narrowed like a starving waste. Rails south of Richmond failed and were fixed slower each time. A single locomotive failure became a district-wide famine. Rations sputtered. Men counted crackers like misers count coins. When a man counts crackers, he does not count days of the siege. He counts the hours until his next handful, and then he stops counting altogether. The last week of the war distilled the lesson. Lee cut west for Danville because the timetable promised rations, trains loaded with flour and meat. Cavalry screens went out. Artillery wheels sank to their hubs in the mud. Long gray columns curved around crossroads and farm lanes. Schedules wrote a fantasy, and raids wrote reality. Union troopers reached Appomattox Station first and seized the trains. The next morning, men who had marched all night attacked to break through to bread. They were not chasing glory. They were chasing food. When that attack failed and the road closed, the arithmetic simplified to something even a private could compute. 0 rations divided by 60,000 men equals surrender. Why could the North keep going when the South could not? Industry is the obvious answer. Organization is the deeper one. Standard gauges mattered. Interchangeable parts mattered. Dedicated railroad troops mattered. A quartermaster who could compel and pay mattered. Replaceable engines and cars mattered. River fleets coordinated with railheads mattered. A national banking system that kept credit flowing mattered. Most important, a mindset that saw ledgers and lorries as combat multipliers, not insults to gallantry, mattered. Paperwork, done right, kills with bread, boots, and bullets, arriving on time in numbers the enemy cannot match. No system is perfect. Confederate officers improvised brilliantly. Corn depots hid in swamps. Rolling stock was husbanded like jewels. Pontoon trains were assembled from church pews and barn doors. Cattle herds walked beside columns. Shoes were captured in raids. Engines were patched with wire and hope. There was heroism in warehouses and on wharves, in the hands that loaded wagons at midnight, and in the clerks who wrote the numbers by candle. But improvisation is a bridge. Strategy is a road. A nation cannot sprint across bridges forever. So name the fatal flaw. It was structural undercapacity, made worse by political fragmentation and strategic miscalculation. The South built a war plan that presupposed foreign help, short campaigns, and a countryside that could feed an army in motion. It got a long war against an industrial opponent that mastered rails and rivers. Once the blockade matured, once rails diverged into junkyards, once horses ate their collars, the Confederacy was not outmaneuvered so much as outsupplied. Battles were symptoms. Logistics was the disease. Here are the lessons, the math that ends wars. Throughput beats bravery. A division with food tomorrow defeats a braver division that ate yesterday. Standardization is a weapon. One gauge, one caliber, and one form save minutes that grow into victories. Money is a supply item. Stable currency moves wagons faster than any speech. Destroy systems, not symbols. Wreck rails, seize depots, and burn mills, and the soldiers will follow the stomach. Centralize what matters. A nation at war is a single factory. Let managers run it or prepare to lose. Return to Appomattox. White flags flickered like moths in morning sun. Men stacked arms and stared at the ground. Somewhere a cook's fire snapped and died. There was no meat to lay in the pan. Two officers traded rations, not words. History calls it surrender. The men called it empty. In the end, the Confederacy did not exhaust its courage. It exhausted its means. Battles are stories we tell with smoke. Logistics is the language those stories are written in. The Confederacy spoke bravely, but the ink ran out. Now we go deeper, not to repeat, but to unfold the layers that made this fate certain long before Appomattox. Walk with me to the depots that defined hope, and to the choices that turned hope into hunger. Picture a county seat in 1862, a courthouse lawn crowded by wagons, a commissary officer standing on the steps with a ledger, farmers and planters lined up with receipts in their hands. The officer reads the prices set by law for corn and bacon, prices already stale by the time his voice reaches the edge of the crowd. A murmur rolls through the men. Some step forward, some step away. Those who sell know they are losing money. Those who refuse know that soldiers somewhere will lose meals. The officer knows both truths and writes names in a trembling hand. He will be cursed in town and praised at the front, and he will sleep badly in both places. Multiply this courthouse by 1,000, and you have the Confederacy's supply chain, human, ethical, and always late. Ride with a forage party. The officer in charge speaks gently at the first farm and firmly at the second. At the third, he speaks with a pistol in his belt. He does not want to be cruel. He wants to be obeyed. The farmer who watches his last hog taken does not see strategy. He sees winter. The soldier who drives the hog does not see robbery. He sees supper. When a nation fights a long war on its own soil without enough money, it forces its soldiers and its farmers into a wrestling match and calls the match patriotism. There are no winners in that ring, only men who walk away angrier than they arrived. Stand at a rail junction on a hot day. Cars groan, engines pant. A conductor waves a sheaf of orders that conflict with each other. One says, load corn for the army in the east. One says, carry powder for the batteries in the west. One says, move hospital stores that have been waiting 3 days. He tries to satisfy all and then satisfies none. A brigade on the line waits for bread. A battery waits for shot. A ward waits for lint and laudanum. By evening, the conductor has made enemies in 3 commands and friends in none. He did not fail. The system did. Walk into a shoe shop with a quartermaster voucher. The owner reads the slip and shrugs. He will sell for cash or trade. He cannot pay his workers in vouchers. He cannot buy leather with promises. The quartermaster argues, and the owner shakes his head with weariness, not defiance. They know each other's names. They know each other's children. They shake hands and part. The soldiers march on, their feet bleeding through old seams. Drill into the numbers again. A brigade of roughly 2,000 effectives, with its staff and teamsters and gunners, eats 6,000 pounds of food each day, more if the issue includes meat and full rations of bread. Its horses and mules consume far more by weight. Even if the men eat cornmeal and bacon, and the animals eat mainly corn, the tonnage is relentless. Add the ammunition load for a serious fight. Add medical stores and fuel for cooking. Add spare harness and shoes. Add the loss factor, the missing barrels, the broken axle, the sacks ripped by careless hooks, and the pilfering that haunts every supply chain in every century. The brigade's daily appetite is a small freight train. Now place that brigade 100 miles from its railhead on winter roads. What you have is not a tactical problem. You have a physics problem disguised as a map. Return to the salt question and consider its social reach. Salt did more than preserve meat for soldiers. It preserved food for cities. The Confederacy's towns swelled with refugees, with the displaced, with the wounded. Without salt, civilian kitchens could not stabilize food for the lean months. Civilian hunger translates into soldier hunger because men write letters and go home. Salt shortages were desertion factors, though no one wrote the equation on a chalkboard. A nation is a system with feedback loops, and salt was a knob that turned the loop toward scarcity. We should speak of medicine as logistics. A wounded man who recovers returns to the ranks as a veteran. A wounded man who sickens for want of clean sheets, proper dressings, decent food, and fresh water leaves the rolls forever. The Union could reach into northern cities and pull out ice and preserved vegetables and hospital supplies in bulk. The Confederacy improvised brilliantly and sometimes beautifully, but improvisation is a burst of light, not a steady lamp. Hospital wagons squeaked because no one had grease to spare. Ambulances broke because carpenters were at the front or in the fields. A broken ambulance is not simply a delay in mercy. It is a lost soldier in a next fight. Return to money one more time, because money is the blood of logistics. When inflation gallops, men hoard goods because goods hold value and paper does not. Hoarding is rational at the scale of a household and destructive at the scale of a nation. Laws against hoarding fight human nature and lose. Price controls fight arithmetic and lose. The only winning move is to stop the printing press or back the notes with the kind of credibility that sellers respect. The Confederacy could do neither consistently. So wagons rolled slower, not because wheels turned slower, but because the human deals that made wheels turn dragged like anchors. Consider the psychology of waiting. An army promised a ration today that arrives tomorrow will wait. An army promised a ration today that arrives next week will forage. An army promised a ration today that never arrives will scatter. Scattering can look like desertion. It can look like straggling. It can look like unauthorized leave. In reality, it is an army decomposing back into individuals in the absence of the glue that only bread and meat can supply. Commanders wrote orders against straggling because they could not order bread into being. Every long war teaches the same grim lesson. Morale is largely a logistical phenomenon wearing a human face. March now with a Confederate column at night. The men are quiet. The wagons creak. The drivers doze and wake with a start. Horses stumble. Somewhere ahead a wheel breaks and a shout runs down the line. Halt. Men groan. Minutes tangle into an hour. The wheel is changed. The line moves again. Dawn comes gray and cold, and someone counts the crackers in the haversack, and counts them again, and knows the count is true. He will fight today because that is what he does. He will fight with a number in his head that is smaller than yesterday's number. That number is not courage, it is bread. Now look across the lines at a Union depot on a riverbank. Steam curls from bakeries. Crates stand in straight rows marked by stencils that match the books in the office. Wagons pull in, are loaded, and pull out with receipts. A quartermaster raises a finger and an officer waits his turn. The officer is not being insulted, he is being put into a machine that works. The machine is not heroic, it is not romantic, it is ugly with order. It wins wars. We should speak of innovation, because innovation is not only a weapon on the battlefield, it is also a habit in the warehouse. The Union habit was to measure, to count, to standardize, and then to teach men to respect the standard because the standard multiplied their strength. The Confederate habit, born of a rural economy and a new government, was to make do and to distrust central orders that smelled like Washington, because central orders had for decades meant something unwelcome in Southern politics. History is not kind to cultures in transition when war interrupts the transition. The Confederacy entered the war during the very moment it needed to rethink how it moved goods, and the war yanked the tablecloth before the dishes could be set. Let us give credit to the Confederate officers who fought this losing fight with brains and grit. They built depots where no depots had been. They inventoried rail cars like misers count coins. They argued with governors and soothed angry farmers. They rode the lines at night and they slept on sacks. They saved rations by throwing bad ones away to prevent sickness. They cut red tape when they could, and they tied it when they had to. They stand in the background of speeches and paintings because ledgers are not romantic. They deserve our notice because they kept men alive longer than the system deserved. We return to the thesis now, not to introduce it, but to close upon it. The fatal flaw in Confederate logistics was structural undercapacity, magnified by political fragmentation and strategic miscalculation, expressed daily as late wagons, thin horses, empty barrels, broken engines, and angry letters home. The Confederacy was brave, but bravery is a resource that needs nourishment. The Union was ruthless in the arithmetic that feeds ruthlessness. In that arithmetic you can find the true shape of the war. So here is the final accounting. Throughput beats bravery. Standardization is a weapon. Money is a supply item. Destroy systems, not symbols. Centralize what matters. And never mistake a full haversack for a luxury. It is a bayonet with the weight removed. April 9th, 1865, returns to us like a bell. White flags flicker. Arms are stacked. Men stare at the ground. Fires pop and die for lack of meat. Two officers trade rations, not words. History calls it surrender. The men called it empty. The Confederacy did not exhaust its courage. It exhausted its means. Battles are stories we tell with smoke. Logistics is the language those stories are written in. The Confederacy spoke bravely, but the ink ran out.